But I'm still going to go back to the question you asked, or what you implied rather, is Georgia a lost cause? Because I've been hearing this throughout many places. Obviously, after what I've just said, it's really hard to counter-argue that it's not a lost cause. But I think it's not a lost cause. And the reason for that is that nonetheless, despite all the things I've just said, and despite all the problems that we have, and despite the speed of the autocratization, or actually to be more realistic, we're 5 minutes away from dictatorship, from one-party dictatorship. But nonetheless, it's not a lost cause. And the reason for that are three, and very short. The reason number one is that you still have resistance against all these measures. You still have protests ongoing for over a year. You still have all these forces, whether they are in Georgia or have exiled. You still have the continuation of resistance and work, albeit in different form. But still, these people, even if they are jailed, they still continue resisting. And so the space for the democratic resistance is shrinking, but it's not gone. I will say it's a lost cause when it will be completely gone. And it's not gone yet. And there's a chance how to maintain that and how to save it from being gone. That's one. The second reason is that you still have over 70% of population who are very European-minded. And yes, this 70% of population, part of them are poor, and the poverty is weaponized against them. This is something that Russia and the Russian proxies have mastered in this neighborhood. You can see the Moldovan example. You can see the other places. So that's one way how this is affected. And the other one is obviously propaganda and the disinformation, which also the current Georgian Dream regime has mastered really, really well. And so with the propaganda and the weaponization of poverty and the oppression and the use of force, this might be broken, but it's not yet. And so that high support is actually very important ally of all of us who believe in the European integration. And the final point is that, look, I would tell those who say that the Georgia is a lost case, and I'm going to finish with this, is that I think what's happening in Georgia is exactly the same process and the same fight that you have, that we all have against Russia in this neighborhood. It's just the different means. In Ukraine, Russia uses the bombs and the drones and the military, but the democratic West and the Europe are supporting brave Ukrainian people who are defending their homeland, but also not just their homeland, but also the European freedom. It's the same fight in Moldova, where Russia tried to take over that country with the electoral manipulation, with the vote buying, but they did not succeed, also because Europe and the pro-Western Moldovan government stood together and countered that. And it's exactly the same fight in Georgia. The only difference, unfortunate difference, is that now the guys who are pro-Russian are in power. And the ones who are not, they are trying to resist that. So the final point is that with the support from the West, from our friends, and also with the spirit the Georgians have showed so far, I think Georgia is not a lost case, and actually this can be reversed. When, I don't know.
In German politics, that in this hour, our leadership in Europe matters perhaps more than at any other point since the end of the Cold War. The United States has taken a very different turn in the past 12 months with their political priorities, and it falls to us as the biggest economy and as the biggest country in terms of population size, and with a great deal of historic responsibility to Central and Eastern Europe, that we fill at least part of that void. And I think that is a conversation that we need to have, because we can no longer afford to be a bystander in many of these questions, because they ultimately touch upon our own national security interests. What happens in Georgia, what happens in Ukraine, what happens in Moldova isn't miles away. It is very much close to home. And if we don't care for it and about it, that situation will care for us in many, many different ways, whether it's when it comes to immigration in the worst cases, refugee movements that we've seen after Russia's colonial war in 2022, and many other things. We need to care. That's my first point that I feel quite passionately about. Now, on concrete steps and measures, I think we need to step up our support for Ukraine in its fight, not just in the military dimension, which I think is and remains tremendously important. But Ukraine's victory will be incomplete, or would perhaps be sabotaged, without also a victory on the home front. And this is a fight about the trajectory of the country, whether it's dragged back into an oligarchic Soviet past that Russia very much wants for all its neighbors and its colonies and proxies, if you look to Belarus, or if it has truly a European future as the vast majority of Ukrainians desire. And if we want to fulfill that ambition, then we also need to support Ukrainian civil society. And I think for far too long, our political conversation in Berlin and Brussels has been timid in addressing that, because our concern was that whenever we talk critically about what's happening in Bankova, we might actually be critical of Ukraine. But this is not Bankova's war. This is the war of the Ukrainian nation, not the Ukrainian state. And there's very much a difference between the Kremlin and Ukraine. On one side is an entire nation fighting, on the other side it's a criminal political system. And that is an appreciation, I think, of there's a difference we need to appreciate, and where we need to be more courageous and we need to be more open. And so let me be very frank, even though I'm a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, when we talk about conditionalities. I have a very hard time selling to my constituents why we should send money to countries where we do not have conditions on how that money is spent and transparency on how it is spent. And so when it comes to Nabu and Sapo, of course, we should do everything in our power as Europeans to protect their independence, to protect the integrity of the electoral process in Ukraine. I cannot stress enough how important it is for any liberal democracy to have a functioning multi-party system. So when I hear conversations of my friends at my political partner parties in Ukraine, how their freedoms are curtailed, how much political pressure is imposed on the opposition, I have a very hard time understanding that and justifying that. And I think these are conversations that we need to have, and they're not from a position of criticism of Ukraine, but one of fierce loyalty and friendship and openness among friends. And so I can fully support and encourage all civil society organizations in Ukraine to speak up, to continue speaking up, and not let anyone be told that you're modeling Ukraine's image abroad. You're doing the contrary by showing the world that you're a pluralist society that is capable of, having all the reflections and open debate that the Kremlin wouldn't want you to have. When it comes to Georgia, well, it's a very different story because, of course, unfortunately, I talked about Belarus being, I'm afraid, a model case for what Russian colonialism does to societies, and the Belarusification that Georgian Nightmare intends to impose on its country, pun intended on the party name, is something that I'm very, very concerned about. And I personally have a hard time understanding of why we've come to this point, especially only such a short time after another Russian invasion of a sovereign country. But it also shows us a possible trajectory in Russia's neighborhood, right? The threat that even though you've fought a war against a country a couple of years ago, being dragged back into the political orbit of that country, even though the majority of your population thinks otherwise, is real, and Georgia demonstrates it. And so, of course, we should do everything in our power to support Georgian civil society in its efforts to resist that. And I'm personally very open to having a conversation on restrictive measures for representatives of that government that indeed tries to drag Georgia further away from us in Europe. But I think if we are very honest about it, the possibilities that we have as Europeans and as Germans in that field are limited. And Moldova in itself, of course, is a very different case because I'm very, very happy that PAS won the elections. I think we would have a different conversation if it wouldn't have worked out. And I understand, Jonas, that you are not the greatest and uncritical fan of PAS. I think that's understandable from a civil society perspective, but I think it's important to work with the pro-European partners that we have and to support them there as well. So that would be my broad picture on all of these things. And the narrative through all of this is we need to be more active, we need to be more involved, and in having that conversation with my electorate and my citizens at home and explaining why these are priorities that Germany should also spend money on. Well, it's much cheaper for us to solve these problems now than to let them grow bigger